So there we go. All right. So here we are. Chas, you are
Yes.
the new host of the Demystifying Atheism podcast. And may the world hear the wisdom that you have to share. And may they
I
hear
hope I have a
my
little bit.
disagreement with your views.
You know, we disagree on things and we agree on things, but we probably agree on more things than typically most evangelical apologists and most atheists would be disagreeing, I think.
There is a certain there are certainly things that we agree upon too as well. And I think, like we were talking about before, a lot of people who disagree do so because they don't define their terms. And if they define their terms, they actually agree in a lot more than they realize. And so I appreciate that you are interested in defining terms and making for clarity. And that's a good thing.
Well, you know, as I've said elsewhere, earlier today, I don't think that Christianity is a bad thing, right? I would never refer to God as a sky daddy or criticize anybody for their faith, unless your name was Fred Phelps or something like that. Mm-hmm. But there's not very many of those as a percentage. But unfortunately, they're the ones who get the press.
Right. Yeah, a lot of times.
For
your listeners, the Fred Phelps is the one who has a very anti-LGBTQ way of speaking, where he expresses a lot of genuine hatred towards
LGBT. Well, I think he's passed away.
Yeah.
But their slogan was "God hates fags."
Right. Yeah.
So,
he represented a very small percentage, I think, of
very, very small
American
percentage
evangelicals, but he got an inordinate amount of press. And I think it's because, well, there were certainly some Christians and others who were mean or hateful towards the LGBT community. Mm-hmm. And so there was a definite desire to stop that. And so one way of stopping that was to portray the haters in a negative light. And he was very willing to be public about his hatred. And so the press focused on him a lot in the past when he was alive, because then they, basically made anyone who disagreed with the LGBTQ behavior look particularly nasty and evil. And so it kind of played into that narrative. And of course, I certainly have a problem with the excessive demonization of sexual conservatives, but I also am glad that there isn't the same level of intolerance as there used to be in the past. And that, I believe in tolerance, meaning respectful disagreement. And so we have a lot more of that towards the LGBT community. Unfortunately, we have increasingly intolerance now towards sexual conservatives who just maybe disagree in a loving way. And they could be Christians or Muslims or Hindus or Orthodox Jews or non-religious people who just agree. And we're getting more and more of that.
I think that, all dialogue can be constructive. None of it needs to demonize. Mm-hmm. But about 90% of the time, there's a saying where two or more are gathered together. There's conflict. I don't remember the phrase. I think it's actually in the Bible.
Well, I think it sounds like Jesus said, when two or more are gathered in my name, I am there with them. I think that's right. Is that what it's referring to?
That's what I'm referring to.
Okay.
In my life, the larger the audience gets, or the larger the number of participants, the greater the percentage chance is that you're going to have somebody who's just there to be nasty.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that happens. That's unfortunate.
And yeah, years ago, I was on a chat program called Internet Relay Chat. I'm still on Internet Relay Chat occasionally.
Mhm.
And there were Christian and atheist and Hindu and Buddhist and, et cetera, different chat rooms. It's divided into channels. And as long as there was only 4 or 5 participants in the channel, the conversation was civil.
Mhm.
But as soon as it became more popular and you had 25 or 30 or, more people, when you had literally people who were only there to sow discord, that was it. That was the only reason.
Mm.
So
That's unfortunate. Yeah.
and no, I think Christianity is a good thing. I think it's delivered more good to the world than it's ever delivered bad.
Mm.
Basically, if you took Christianity out of the world, we wouldn't have universities in the same sense that we do today. We wouldn't have modern medicine in the same way that we do today. Modern science depends an awful lot on Christian natural philosophers.
True.
So, I don't understand, the ethic of reciprocity, golden rule, otherwise known as. When I was taking philosophy courses in university, I had one professor who was very big on, what was it called? The principle of charity. Always interpret what your opponent, if you want to call it an opponent, their point of view in the most charitable way possible. And I thought that was really dumb for a long time. I was a kid. I thought it was really dumb because sometimes you sort of had to bend over backwards to find any charitable interpretation. But as I've gotten older, I've realized the wisdom of that.
Right. Yeah.
So,
well, I appreciate you. I think one of the big things happening today is that there's been a shift in culture where before people might say Christianity is false, there wasn't that many people who were atheists who say that. Other people would, just want to say it's subjectively true, which kind of indirectly is saying it's objectively false. But now, though, the thing is, people are a lot more focused, not whether it's true or not, but they just want to say it's evil. It's homophobic, it's transphobic, it's racist, misogynistic, responsible for colonialism. And I think they forget a lot of the good things that Christians have done. And you've mentioned some of those, like, for example, universities largely came about because of Christians, churches and such founding them. A lot of universities in the States, were done that, in Europe. Canada too, as well, other countries as well. A lot of, even in Korea where you live, Seoul, I believe Yonsei University is still a Christian university today, one of the top 3. And then Seoul Foreign School, which is a private school attached to that, was also started, as or still is a private school and somewhat Christian. And then lots of hospitals were started in the name of Christianity, lots of work to help the poor, Salvation Army, World Vision, lots of other things. And so, and yeah, have bad things been done in the name of Christianity? Yeah, there have been. But as a Christian, I'd always want to say, well, there are bad things done in the name of almost everything, including atheistic communism and all kinds of other different things. And as a Christian, I want to say, well, what is Christianity all about? It's not about those bad things, but it's about specifically the teachings of Jesus and what is taught as the way to live in Scripture too. And I don't see those bad things endorsed in the Bible. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't know the Bible well. They don't know the teachings of Jesus well. And so that a lot of times is irrelevant to them, unfortunately.
Well, from the perspective of a non-believer, and I'm not going to say from the perspective of atheists, but from someone who's not part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? The Bible is just 66 books, right? That are full of poetry and wisdom writings and history and prophecy, etc. So they're looking at it from a different perspective. And I'm not going to express any opinion on whether it's any of those things, all of those things, or none of those things. But it's a book that has probably had more influence on the world than anything that's ever been written, right? I mean, Shakespeare's had a lot of influence, and J.K. Rowling's had a lot of influence. I'm joking there, but she has.
Muslims might want to contend with
the
that
Quran
for the case for the Quran, and they might have a case. It's of course it's different. There's a difference between the degree of influence something's had and whether it's true or not, right? I'm sure you'd agree with that too. So,
sure.
As a Christian, it's possible the Quran has had more influence. I think you could make a good counter argument to that, or a strong one. But like, even if it was true, it wouldn't mean Islam is true, and vice versa.
No.
Christianity's had a big influence. You said it doesn't mean it's necessarily true.
Right. I admire an awful lot about Christianity. I'm not remembering off the top of my head. I think it's in Matthew 35 or something, where Jesus tells the story of, he says, if you fed me, if you've clothed me, if you've taken me in when I was homeless, etc. And you're welcome into my kingdom. And the people who were listening said, well, when did we feed you? And when did we clothe you? And when did we take you in when you were homeless? And he says, well, if you, sorry, this is a very important story to me. If you did this for the less of, for the least, you've done it for me. And, for me, that's the important part of Christianity. I don't believe in the resurrection, but, from my own perspective, that doesn't, whether the resurrection actually occurred or whether it didn't occur, Christianity has a lot to offer as a lifestyle, as a, I don't want to call it a lifestyle because that sounds like I'm diminishing it, but as a wise way to live life, right? Yeah. So I would just sort of like to see more cooperation between, I'll tell you something that I really hate. I'll be on Facebook or some other forum. I'm on way too many forums. And inevitably, there is somebody meaning well who will say, a fool in his heart.
The fool says in his heart, there is no God.
Exactly.
The Psalms, right?
And that doesn't add anything to the conversation. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't actually add anything to the conversation. And then, well, you have people who very sincerely will try to explain, why they left Christianity. And I understand the biblical reasons for this, but then you have sometimes a throng of Christians who will say, well, you were never really a Christian in the first place. And even if that's true, it isn't necessarily the best way of persuading anybody.
Yeah, I can agree with you. And if I can take a step back, I appreciate, obviously, as a Christian, I think it's it very much is important whether Christianity is true, especially for those Christians who take Jesus' words seriously and talk about the blessings that comes for suffering in the name of Jesus. And some Christians have suffered a great deal. If it's not true, then that matters. So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if Jesus is not raised from the dead, then your faith is futile and you're still in your sins. And someone like the Apostle Paul, who suffered a great deal, it matters a lot whether Jesus actually rose from the dead. But I know for you as an atheist, I think it's a compliment, though, to talk about the positive things that Christianity has done and talk about the values that the positive impact that Christianity has on individual people's lives and of society. So I appreciate that it's kind of an olive wreath that you extend in that sense. And I also will agree with you in terms of when Christians quote, I think it's Psalm 14, verse 1, saying the fool says in his heart, there is no God. That, I think that's true because I think what the Bible says is true, but it's not always that helpful in a conversation with someone else to be saying that, because you're indirectly just calling them a fool, right? Or, if somebody quotes, if a Marxist is talking with me and he quotes Karl Marx saying, the religion is the opium of the masses. Okay,
right.
I understand where you're coming from, but what do you want me to say? Like, you're just basically saying I'm high on drugs. Okay, obviously I don't take it that way. Does this help me be convinced of your view? No, I don't see why telling me I'm high on drugs is, going to help, right? And I likewise, I think telling someone they were never saved in the first place, I understand where that's coming from, and some atheists might not always appreciate that. For those in the Reformed Christian tradition, someone who is genuinely put their faith in Jesus can never lose their salvation. So if somebody walks away from their faith, given that theology, you must conclude that they were never actually saved in the first place, even if they appeared so. It wasn't genuinely that way. Now, not all Christians take a Reformed view, and I'm not trying to be for it or against it. I'm just trying to explain that that's what stems from that. It's not necessarily, and I realize you can appreciate these things, Chas, but for our listeners, it's not necessarily an attempt to dig at that person, although it could be, it could be a way of saying, well, I don't care if you left Christianity because you were never Christian in the first place. But I think sometimes at least it stems from that theological perspective. But of course, like you said, regardless of whether Reformed theology is true or Christianity is true, I'm not sure it really helps someone to tell them they were never really a believer in the first place. It's not.
I don't think that it does. Partly because anybody engaged in a dialogue, and we're in a dialogue right now, there are things that you believe to be incontrovertibly true. There are things that I believe to be incontrovertibly true. But there's not really any dialogue that occurs or is even possible to occur if I'm not willing to listen to any of your logic or evidence, and you're not willing to listen to any of mine. If you're just spend the whole time talking past each other, and there's no possibility of somebody who tells you, some of the things we've just discussed, that there's any dialogue that's actually occurring. About 99% of the time that any contributor to, like some of the mass dialogues that occur on Facebook tells you that you were never really a Christian or that you're a fool, those are their only contributions. They sort of take that little pot shot and then retreat.
And sadly, that's because there's a lot of Christians who are not very familiar with Christian apologetics, or you putting it another way is just reasons for believing that Christianity is true. And it's also disappointing. There's a lot of Christians who think they've got some sophisticated reasons for believing. But I know as someone who studied these things a fair bit, I hear what they're saying and I think, wow, an atheist could take that apart in about 30 seconds. Like, there's a lot of problems with what you're saying. And I say that now, of course, I also think there's people who are ignorant or unsophisticated in their reasons, and all religions and worldviews, certainly atheism too as well. And, I encounter lots of that. And I'm sure you see that on your side too as well. But, it's just a lot. Sadly, some people don't like to think very deeply, and they don't realize that their thinking is quite shallow until they engage with someone. And then sadly, when their arguments get torn apart, they feel frustrated, and then they kind of lash out, and they just kind of say whatever they can to make themselves feel better. And maybe it's something like, you were never a Christian in the first place, or you'll find out you're wrong when you're dead, or something like that.
Oh yeah, that's pretty frequent. That's pretty frequent. But you have atheists who are as bad or worse because you need to go talk to your sky daddy about that.
Mhm.
Do you pray before you use the bathroom? Sort of thing.
Kind of condescending, mocking statements.
Condescending, and the atheists who say things like, there are 5,500 different gods in the world. I just believe in, you just believe in, right.
I know these phrases better than you, Chaz.
Yeah. Well, it's just that it's such a stupid phrase, because in actually, if you look at, so the population of the world right now is slightly less than 8 billion people, right? And, there's about 2.5 million Christians in the world. And I think right about 2 million Muslims in the world right now, depending on who's counting, right? And if you take all of the Buddhists and the Hindus and the Sikhs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, well, we know what gods they believe in. So if there's actually 5,000 something gods that people still believe in the world, that means that there are 4 or 5 people who believe in each of them. It just, the math doesn't make any sense. And it's irrelevant anyway.
Yeah, although Hindus, I think, are traditionally said to have something like 330 million different gods. So, there's a question of whether they believe, they won't necessarily know of every single one of them.
Right.
But they could acknowledge that there are that many out there, right?
Hindus actually, I used to be a member of a group called the Suffolk Interfaith Resource Center, and we had lots of Hindu members. And literally, we got together and talked about each other's religious faiths. We had Mormons and evangelical Christians and Buddhists and Baptists and Hindus and Satanists and you name it, right? And it was on the university campus of Ipswich University in the UK. But anyway, I learned from the Hindus that they don't really believe in that many gods. They believe in one, Brahman, or maybe it's Brahma, but that he had a lot of avatars. But it was still one god. And all of the rest of the pantheon were expressions of the one god.
Yeah, I think from my study of Hinduism, there's a lot of variety within Hinduism. So there's certainly many Hindus who would take that view. Of course, usually Vishnu or Shiva are the 2 gods that are most often worshipped in India amongst Hindus. There's the kind of 3 key gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And of those 3, Vishnu and Shiva are the ones that are worshipped the most. So followers of Vishnu are Vaishnavites, and followers of Shiva are Shaivites, or there's different ways of expressing it.
Right.
But yeah, and a lot of times they will say that Vishnu is incarnated in different ways as Krishna and different gods, or there's other ways of turning it around.
I've known Hindus who didn't believe in any gods whatsoever. I mean, you can be an atheist and be an Hindu. I don't remember which school that is because it's broken up into lots of different schools.
I kind of
I think
question that though, because usually the basic definitions of Hinduism, I think, would reject that way of understanding Hinduism. And like if a Christian tells me he doesn't believe in God, I can't stop him from calling himself a Christian, but I would say, no, you're not a Christian, right? And so I think also
I would agree with you. Yeah.
These words have to exclude certain people or certain things, otherwise they become meaningless. So, also I question whether a Hindu says there is no God or gods whatsoever, unless they're saying it's just Maya, it's illusion in the end, which is part of many Hindu traditions.
I think that's actually one of the traditions that I'm talking about.
Okay.
The things that atheists say that makes me the most irritated is the everybody's really an atheist. You just believe in one God more than I do. And that annoys me because an atheist is somebody who doesn't believe any gods at all. Period. Full stop. If you believe in a God, you're not an atheist.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about those atheists? There's a lot of atheists these days who want to define atheism as simply the lack of belief in God. So sometimes it's nicknamed lack theism. I think you disagree with that view, right?
I do disagree with it, but it's complicated. It's complicated because, okay, I'm going to use a phrase here that I like to use, minimally entails. So atheism minimally entails that a person doesn't believe in God, right? Mm-hmm. Technically, somebody who is not even cognizant of the idea of gods is an atheist, but that's not useful at all. I'm not arguing for that because that means my socks are atheists, right? Mm-hmm. My goldfish is an atheist, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to have, for me, it's pointless to refer to someone as an atheist if it's not a position that they hold, if it's not a stance, right? Mm-hmm. So somebody who somehow was born in a part of the world or maybe in the future on a different planet and they've never heard the concept of God, it's true, yeah, they don't believe in God, but it's sort of ridiculous to me to call them an atheist, right? Mm-hmm. So I entirely think the whole idea of lack atheism, I have lots of people on Facebook, on Quora, on Reddit who will say, I just lack belief in God. And then you look at their chat history and they've spent 5,000 hours arguing about it on Facebook. Mm-hmm. Well, you don't spend 5,000 hours arguing about something that you just lack belief in. Right.
And I think that's a kind of touches on a key issue here that, like, when an atheist says, "Oh, I just lack belief in God," and that's what atheism is, it doesn't tell us why they lack that belief. I mean, it tells them about their psychology, or you could say their noetic structure, but it doesn't tell us why they do that. I mean, they could lack belief in God for many different reasons. Perhaps they don't understand the concept of God. Perhaps they are biased against the existence of God. Perhaps they have never heard of any convincing arguments for God, or perhaps they don't actually understand the arguments properly, or perhaps they've heard the arguments for God, taken them seriously, considered them carefully, and rejected them as providing any kind of good reason to believe God exists. And that latter view is what I think most lack theists hold to. But just saying they lack belief in God doesn't articulate that. It just says you lack belief. I mean, okay, and they'll usually say, look, I lack belief in Smurfs or Santa Claus or leprechauns. Okay, that's one way of putting it. But you can also say you lack belief in the existence of the moon, or in distant galaxies, or in subatomic particles, or, there's different ways of thinking about lacking belief in God. And so they're always thinking in terms of lacking belief in other things that we know don't exist, such as Santa Claus, right? But maybe God is like the moon. Maybe they lack belief in God the same way someone can lack belief in the moon because they haven't opened their eyes and looked at the moon, right? It's still an open issue that you have to decide which of those is the right way of thinking of it.
I have my own theory on this. So, I'm 61 and I've been an atheist for 30 years, roughly, a little bit more than 30 years. When I became an atheist, Bertrand Russell was it, right? Anybody who became an atheist 30 to 50 years ago was familiar with Bertrand Russell. And he defined famously atheism, agnosticism, and theism. Atheism was somebody who believed it was possible to know that God didn't exist. A theist was someone who believed it was possible to know that God did exist. And an agnostic was someone who believed it was impossible to know. And that was really influential. That's how, most people from my generation of atheism thought about it, right? It was the first time they'd ever actually seen the words defined generally. And then Antony Flew in the 70s sort of redefined it. Antony Flew, and I can send it to you if you want. I have the quotes, sort of, in a way, was responsible for the whole. He redefined atheism in the 70s and sort of gave his own imprimatur to the lack atheism idea. But atheists, not all of them, but most of the reason, one of the main reasons that atheists took that and ran with it is because
Jas, can I interrupt you for a
years,
second?
Sure.
You might want to turn your camera down a little bit because you're hitting the bottom of the screen and then you're getting cut off. It's like you're sinking. We can't see you.
Sorry. How's that?
Good.
So for years, atheists would say to Christians, well, that's just something that you believe. It's just a belief. And they could dismiss Christianity as not being a fact, but just a belief. So suddenly Christians could say back, well, your atheism is just a belief. And no atheist wanted to have their wanted to be dismissed that way. So I just lack belief. It's, matter of fact, most atheists, or not most, but a very, very large percentage of atheists deny that atheism was a belief at all, which is ridiculous. Of course it is.
And I think that's, again, defining the words, because they think of belief, the way they're defining belief or understanding the word is something that people hold to that lacks any evidence, right? So they want to say all their ideas in their mind are things that have evidence. They only believe things that have evidence, or they only hold to ideas that have evidence, and that's why they have no beliefs. It's not the way philosophers understand the word, right? In epistemology, the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge, they define knowledge as justified true belief, and sometimes they'll add on that's non-accidentally true, but we don't have to get into that. But they say everything that you know is something that's
or however you say his name.
Who? Sorry,
I'm trying to think something Quine.
Quine?
I'm trying to think of the Quine. Was he the person who said who did the justified true belief?
I think that goes back to Aristotle.
Aristotle.
Justified true beliefs is the way Aristotle understood it. And then Edmund Gettier is the one who cause people to think, well, that are also non-accidentally true. But we don't have to get into that. But just the way the philosophers understand knowledge is, in order to know something, you have to believe it. But it goes from belief to knowledge if it's justified, you have reasons, and if it's true.
So I think of belief a little bit differently, I think, than a lot of atheists do, and maybe than a lot of people do. I don't think his knowledge and belief as being different things. I think that knowledge is a belief, but on a continuum of greater certainty. So you're confident that something is true to the extent that you'll say, I know that it's true, but there have been too many examples in my own life and just in history of things that you know were true that weren't, right? So we don't really know what we know, unfortunately. But
you don't know what you
still
don't know, or what did you say that again? You know what you know?
We don't, with some exceptions, you don't know what you know, because if you knew what you knew, then you would never be wrong about what you thought you knew. Think about in your own life, there have been things that you were 100%, unless you're different than me, there have been things that I was 100% positive on, right? That I was still eventually wrong about.
Okay, so I think what you want to say is you don't know what you don't know, or you don't know what you believe that's actually not true, right? You don't know where you're
vice
wrong.
versa. And vice versa. I do think there are things that effectively we know that are axiomatic. I know that I exist, right?
Okay.
I'm not what's the word? Solipsist?
Well, a solipsist is someone who believes they exist, but nobody else exists. Everybody else is just...
I've read about different levels of that. There's like metaphysical solipsists and sorry, I don't know all of the jargon for it, but I've talked to people who weren't even sure whether they existed, which seems sort of ridiculous to me. Okay. Because whether they did or it didn't make any, it's sort of a pointless belief system, from my perspective. It's not very pragmatic. It's not very practical.
If I could comment a little bit of agnosticism, you talked about theism, atheism, agnosticism. One area, though, I will, there's some lack-theists who call themselves agnostic atheists. And of course, there's different ways. I call myself an agnostic atheist. Okay, well, there can be different ways of understanding that word and defining it. But one thing I do agree with, and this might be an area you agree with, I don't think anybody can actually be agnostic when it comes to the existence of the Christian God and most or all of the religions of the world, because everybody lives their life a particular way, and you show by the way you live your life what you believe. So if you're not living as a Muslim, and you don't even think you should live as a Muslim, and you don't even think you should look into Islam, then I think that shows a certain level of confidence that Islam is false. All the religions of the world present solutions to our ultimate problems, right? Everybody senses something wrong in the world, whether you call that evil or suffering or pain or alienation or whatever word you use. We are looking for solutions to our problems, and all the religions of the world offer us ultimate types of solutions, or something that at least goes beyond this physical world. If you're not, if someone's not interested in looking into one of those religions, that shows there's a certain level of confidence that that doesn't have the answers that we're looking for. And so I think everybody shows by their lives that if they're not living as a Buddhist, they don't think Buddhism is true. If you're not living as a Muslim, you don't think Islam is true. And if you're not living as a Christian or interested in finding out about Christianity or anything like that, I think you show a particular level of confidence that Christianity is not true. So that's
I
important
agree
because
with
a
you.
lot of people today just see themselves, they won't even use the word agnostic, but they just see themselves as undecided or neutral. And they don't want to call themselves an atheist. But this group is either functionally atheist or they are actually creating their own religion. They're spiritual but not religious. Okay, but that's really just creating your own religion, and you're the founder of your own religion. And since you're not living as any of the other religion, you think your religion or spirituality, if you want to call it, is true, and the other ones are false.
I actually agree with you on that. I call myself an agnostic atheist for convenience, really, because while I don't believe in God, I don't know that he doesn't exist. So it's sort of a shorthand way of expressing that. Some people think of agnosticism as not being able to know anything, right? Some people apply it just to belief in, gods. And I don't really care which way it's applied, but most atheists, if they say they're an agnostic atheist, not all of them, that's how they mean it. Well, he might exist. I'm not eliminating it from the realm of possibility, but I don't believe that he does.
Yeah. And so I think what you're doing is you're expressing the degree of confidence or degree of certainty you have whether atheism is true or not, right? And in that sense, I can respect that. I think when it comes to lots of different things, we can have different degrees of certainty about, the truth of one view or another, right?
So what a lot of atheists don't realize, a surprising number, but at the same time, Christians don't realize it either, is that there's a huge number of atheists who are actually deists. And I know that, depending on how you define deism, that deism can be considered sort of a subset of theism. But I'll tell you the definition that I use. A theist thinks of God or gods as the omnipotent, omniscient creators of the universe who remain involved with the universe they've created, right? A deist basically believes that God or gods exists, but that this God wound the universe up on creation day and then walked away.
Right, that's deism.
And
he doesn't involve himself in the world. There's no miracles.
Doesn't involve himself, exactly.
Right.
And there's a surprising number of atheists who, if you really prod and poke, that's what they believe. And they believe it because, because they've considered, even if they didn't think about it as such, they've considered the intelligent design argument. They've read, Signature of the Cell, or and
Myers book, right?
Right. And it's not a stupid argument. Neither one of those are stupid arguments. So how do I say this? So most atheists, if you ask them whether they believed there were intelligent life forms in this universe that were smarter than humankind, would say yes. An awful lot of atheists are science fiction fans, and they're envisioning a Star Trek universe, right? I mean, huge numbers. And if you extrapolate that, once you've conceded that elsewhere in the universe there probably exists beings that would make us look like bacteria by comparison, well, it's easy to hypothesize, the existence of God, right? See how that levels. Not necessarily the God of theism, but a God of deism, right? A deistic God.
So wait, there's a difference though between alien beings within the universe and some type of being outside the universe that creates it, right? There's a little bit of a jump there.
I agree with you. But after having had this conversation with hundreds and hundreds of atheists, that's what a lot of them will concede. Even if, you're right. That's an illogical final step.
But that's what you find amongst many atheists.
A lot of atheists are actually deists. Even if that's not every word that they would apply to themselves. But if you listen to what they actually believe about God, and I'm not even going to pretend to, yes, there are Islamic apologists, but the argument in the West pits Christianity against atheism. That's it, right? That's what sells all of the books. That's why there's 50,000 web pages. That's what, all of the YouTube videos, etc.
Sure.
And there is a little bit of the Islamic argument, but it's not really arguing against.
It depends where you go, but I think in the last few decades, with greater Muslim immigration into the Western world, you have much more of Islam being part of that discussion. And given that the fact that Muslims in Muslim countries are learning English more and more and can engage in online discussions too. So you do, have that more and more. But historically, at least, and still in many ways today, it's the Christian God versus atheism in the West. I grant.
Yeah.
That. But let me also touch on a little bit of what you said there, because you seem to be saying that you were saying that a lot of atheists tend to be deists, and that a lot of times this is influenced by the fact that they are much more open to the possibility of life existing on alien planets. Perhaps tell me in your experience if this is the case. Let me, in a roundabout way, come back to this point, because I want to talk about a different issue in multiverse and different universes, and then come back to this. It's occurred a lot of times. This is probably going to be more for our listeners, I'm pretty sure, than you. There is an argument for the existence of God from physics. That is, there's certain constants found in the laws of physics that are very precisely tuned that make it possible for our universe to exist in the way that it does, and make it possible for life to exist in our universe. And so this has been one argument for the existence of God, is saying these constants are very finely tuned, and therefore this is evidence that there was a God that created this universe and intended for us to exist. One atheist response to this is that we can explain this by chance by just invoking or considering the possibility that our universe is one of many universes, perhaps an infinite number of universes. And some of those other universes could have very different laws of physics in them, very different constants, and all kinds of different things in them. So one of the things I like to, so I appreciate that. I'm not going to try to my desire is not to have a full-on discussion of that issue, although we could at some point in time. The thing I've thought about is, well, sometimes when I've talked to atheists about this and they've said there's other universes, I sometimes ask them, well, in these other universes, could there be other beings just like us? And usually the atheists will say yes. And then I say, well, could some of those beings also be very different from us and be much more powerful, much more knowledgeable, be able to do things that would amaze us? And they say yes. And then I say, well, is it possible that perhaps even they could figure out how to affect other universes? The answer is often yes. well, is it possible that in one of these universes they could even figure out how to create another universe, perhaps even our universe? And it seems
Right.
hard
That's a
to
good
fathom
argument.
that.
Yeah, I like
And
that.
then I say, well, okay, sounds like you're getting closer and closer to the Christian God, right? Like for the Christian God is in not necessarily say another universe, but in another dimension, which could be described as an infinite universe, perhaps outside of ours. And the only kind of difference now is this Christian God is not just enormously powerful, but is all powerful, all knowing, and also perfectly good. So you're not quite all the way there, but you are a big step closer to that. And it seems like if you're open to these other universes, it's hard not to count that as a possibility, which now at least could be a form of deism too, as well, right?
Oh,
Do you
sure.
think
Yeah.
this kind of thing plays into what you just said before? Like we're not talking about beings in other planets, but beings in other universes.
Oh, definitely. That does play into it. You know, I hate the multiverse argument. It's never an argument that I would make. For me, I don't believe there's any such thing as chance in the universe at all.
Okay.
As Voltaire said, chance is a word invented by man to express the visible effects of all unknown causes. For me, that sums it up.
Okay.
Uh,
What about in quantum physics with subatomic events?
oh,
There seems to be some pretty unknown causes going down there.
well, an unknown cause doesn't mean that there wasn't one.
Yeah, so
Because
now
I
this
can't,
gets into
you know,
whether you take a Copenhagen interpretation of it or one of the other many philosophical interpretations of quantum physics.
for me, okay, I don't want to say that I'm a determinist because I don't know, strictly speaking, that's true. We live in a probabilistic universe, right? And I give this example. Nobody's ever dropped a pancake and had it fall up, ever. It's never happened, right? It might have been caught by wind and flown up, but then it didn't fall up, right? We depend, our whole universe, as far as we know, depends on this amazing regularity.
Can I
And
just have to, I understand what you mean with I thought when you meant it falls up, like falls one side up, like a peanut butter and jam sandwich
no.
always falls one
I
side
mean,
up.
like,
How would I try to
falls up
be,
into
okay. It doesn't just
yeah,
levitate up back into the
it
pan.
doesn't
Okay.
levitate up, right? Um, from my belief is that things can happen one way and one way only. And it's really, it doesn't mean that I can predict. I mean, maybe someday, and I'm sort of hoping not, that AI will grow sophisticated enough that they can basically predict with a lot of accuracy how every decision I'm going to make for the rest of my life. I'm not saying 100% accurate, right? But they might be able to, sort of input everything known about a person's life and predict very likely outcomes, let's say, right? So no, I don't believe that there's any such thing as chance. So I don't find very persuasive any of the arguments that say it could have been, that it's this to the power of blah, 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 blah.
Cassie,
I don't find any of that convincing.
Your camera is syncing.
That?
You're syncing.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. So it's like, how do I say this? Yeah, things can happen one way. So, the anthropic principle, right? The anthropic principle.
That we wouldn't be able to see the constants and the laws of physics fine-tuned the way they are unless we were here. They have to be that way in order for us to exist here, right?
If things could have been any other way, they would be that way and we wouldn't know, right? And and that even fits, depending on who you are, that even fits that's a compatible belief, actually, in a sense, with some conceptions of God. I know Christians who believe in an old universe and in theistic evolution, right?
Mhm.
Who believe that the universe, and I know lots of Roman Catholics this would apply to. Saint or Pope Francis even has said that God's not a wizard, right? That evolution and Big Bang, etc., were all things that God put in motion, right? And if you're plus even C.S. Lewis, and I think actually Thomas Aquinas sort of say a similar thing, that God can do everything that it's possible to do. Not that he can do everything. He can't do the impossible. In The Problem of Pain, I think C.S. Lewis addresses that, and maybe in a whole chapter, that God can do literally everything that it is possible to do.
Right. Now the key thing
Which
here is, though,
means,
what does possible mean, right? And a lot of Christians are going to chafe at that because they would say everything is possible to God. But where I'll agree with you is that most Christian philosophers and theologians who've been conservative throughout history understand God's limitation to the laws of logic and also to his perfectly good nature too, as well. They don't think God can go against his perfectly good nature because there's verses in the Bible that suggest he can. In the book of Hebrews, I think it's chapter 6, it says it is impossible for God to lie. So any Christian who's going to reject what you just said has to contend with that verse. How can the Bible say
right,
it's impossible for God to do something? It's impossible for him to lie. And usually the way Christian theologians understand it is that God has a perfectly good nature or essence, what he's made of, and it doesn't allow him to do anything sinful. And that is only going to work too, as well, is if God is bound also by the laws of logic. Because if God's not bound by the laws of logic, then it's important to understand that properly, because the laws of logic are not the same thing as the laws of nature. This is not saying that God cannot do miracles. That's something else. God can do miracles. That's something I believe, and the Bible teaches it. But the laws of logic are direct. If you violate the laws of logic, you're having a direct contradiction. So if God can violate the laws of logic, he can do something sinful or evil repeatedly and still be perfectly good at the same time, in the same sense. So Hebrews says that God cannot lie. And the point there is that we can trust his promises. We can trust him. How can you trust him if he can break his promises, do something that's wrong, and still be completely honest and perfectly good? Now, somebody might react and say that's incoherent. Yes, that's the point. If God can break the laws of logic, we can have incoherent situations, which God can do, right? So I also agree that God can only do that which is possible. And I think the correct way of understanding what God can possibly do is anything that's logically coherent, that doesn't break the laws of logic, and that doesn't violate his perfectly good nature, his perfect being.
And, with the exception of the perfectly good nature aspect, I agree with you 100%. I think of logic as inferences from observing reality. Logic is sort of inferences that we've made about the way that reality works based on what we've observed. And, like the law of non-contradiction, I'm pretty confident. As a matter of fact, I'll go so far as to say I know that I am not in South Korea and simultaneously actually sitting in a cafe in Tbilisi, right? That would, and that's just the law of non-contradiction. I can't exist in two places simultaneously. Of course, maybe quantum entanglement messes that up a little bit. I don't know. I don't really understand quantum entanglement. But All of the
Well,
things that I would say that I know are things that I derive from logic, not from anything else.
yeah. Well, maybe should we finish up for today? We had a good discussion, I think, about a lot of different
Sure.
things out there. And yeah, I appreciate dialoguing with you, because I feel like there's some atheists I talk to and they don't know enough about these things to have a sophisticated, intelligent discussion. It's like they'll say things and I'm like, no, pretty well all the smart atheists out there will disagree with you on that, right? Or at least the smart atheist philosophers. And I can tell them that, but they won't believe me because I'm a Christian theist and I'm just out there to, I'm just crazy or dumb or something. But I feel like I can have a much more sophisticated conversation with you because you've spent much more time thinking about these things and studying these things. So I appreciate that.
Well, it's an important question. And, likewise, you're eminently fair and you're logical, right? You've never, you're not Brian Bissell.
I have no comment.
You can cut that out, but yeah. Kevin Crawford, I admire a great deal too. As I think actually, I don't know for sure. Kevin Crawford is pretty liberal in some of his beliefs.
Yeah, for the listeners out there, you want to know these are people that Chas and I interact with or see on online, on Facebook mainly. So that's where
on Facebook primarily.
They're not well-known celebrity people.
Not well-known celebrities.
Just like us, we're not well-known celebrity atheists or theists or anything either.
No, I would hate to be a celebrity.
Okay.
I want the money. That's it. Just the money.
Not the fans harassing you. You don't.
Not the fans harassing me. And to be honest, this is totally off subject, but I have never. I mean, if you combined my best income and my wife's best income, I have never even ascended into lower middle class, right?
Okay.
I'm sort of upper, I don't know how they divide it. If I'm middle class, I'm at the very bottom rung of that. And that's okay. I'm very comfortable. I have no dreams of avarice.
Well, even though I disagree strongly on your atheist position, I am very happy that you are, in my opinion or my view, very blessed by God and many good things in your life.
Well, thank you.
All right.
And you likewise. Say hello to your wife.
Okay, I'll do it. And I have a good one.